For everybody listening in, can you share with us a little bit more about your journey into the field of mental performance and also to initially what sparked that interest?
Yeah. So, journey for me started when I was a gymnast a long time ago. Well, I say a long time ago. For me, it was a long time ago. When I was younger, I ended up doing club gymnastics for a good portion of my life from about 6 to about 12, 13. And at that point, I had never heard of like sports psychology, mental performance. I knew what mental blocks were for sure because gymnasts have them a lot. So that was familiar. But the biggest thing for me was having experience with a sports psychologist professional. And she was able to show me just like what the heck it is and that you can do it for a job, which I thought was really cool. And then on top of that, she was very helpful in terms of my fears. The biggest mental blocks were beam. I know a lot of gymnasts can agree with that. But that was the starting point. That was kind of like my introduction to sports psychology, mental performance, and just the way that she would connect with us as athletes, being able to advocate, have a voice for us, because gymnastics culture has gotten a lot better, but it can be pretty toxic like a lot of sports. So that was another big reason. And then fast forward to kind of going into high school. I really wanted to do high school and club, which is a little crazy, and decided to just go right into high school, try it out, but unfortunately had a previous injury. And that was kind of like the beginning of the end for me. I had this goal to, go to the Olympics and train really hard for that. And it ended up being at that time, like a really good, prestigious meet for me, like what we call regionals. And it was the day before that we were training, warming up and everything. I had my injury. And it was just kind of one of those like identity hits where you were expecting something so brutal to happen so quickly. And then you just can't wrap your head around, wait, I had never thought of not being an athlete. So, not just that, but multiple times after like the progression of waiting to get surgery, trying to, move forward with healing and everything like that, I started filling in the gaps for myself of I would love to advocate for injured athletes. That was a big thing for me. I ended up finishing off my career as an injured athlete, unfortunately, just off and on. Was able to find really awesome sports to kind of complement that, though, such as swimming and diving. That was really nice to rehab with. So, just a whole host of things together that I kind of like brought together as my influence.
And obviously, I feel like injuries are the most unavoidable thing in sports. You don't know when your time is. I remember, when I was at basically, I think my sophomore season in college, I ended up having a hand injury. And, it's always like the smallest little things that you think aren't ever going to happen to you. And of course, it happens to you. And then next thing you know, like for myself, it was like, I'm starting, now I'm not, now I'm having to work myself back into the lineup. And it's just that huge mental hurdle to even jump over to. But really, on a lot of the athletes' ends, like mine, you're not really getting much help other than the athletic trainer trying to rush you back or do
Right.
stuff like that. I know for myself too, throughout high school, throughout college, I'd hear sprinkles on social media as far as, some topics relating to sports psychology, relating to mental performance. And, but then you'd also hear some people who are way pro or way against it and on, way different realms.
Mm.
But ultimately, too, what are some common misconceptions that you typically hear about mental performance and how do you go about addressing those?
Yeah, that's a good question and actually good timing because I was just talking with some of my athletes previously about these misconceptions, just like the language that they would use to describe what they thought mental performance was, what it was used for, what arenas to use it in, and like the timing of it, just all of that. A big, big misconception that I think a lot of times comes up in my conversations is mental performance is strictly for sport. That is a big misconception as yes, it's great in the arena of performance. That's what it's meant for. But the biggest thing is like we are working with total athletes. We want the whole athlete wellness, right? And whole athletes don't just have compartments of their life. Everything kind of intersects at some point. And being able to work through not just what's going on in the gym, on the field, like in practice, not at practice, what else is going on outside of that, like at home? What struggles are you working through at home with family? What about friendships? What about school? And really evolving the athlete as, a whole because of the performance that they have in life. Like life is a performance. That's usually what I say. You perform in any aspect of life. You're preparing for things in life. You're debriefing a lot. It makes so much sense in sport because that's just a small little snippet of it. But really being able to help shape that narrative that our identity isn't just sport. And that's where mental performance can kind of feel like it's just going to sit in that area, if that makes sense. But that's one big misconception.
Definitely. And I like that you talked about life performance in general and even bring up the classroom because when you brought that up, it jogged my memory to a lot of teammates who not I don't want to say a lot, but there's that handful who they struggle in the classroom and if they start struggling enough or they know, hey, it's going to affect their eligibility, then you see it really just almost not a giving up necessarily, but just being like, hey, you know what, if I'm not going to, be able to get my grades up and get to the point where I'm eligible, then why even try on the field and whatever their sport is. So yeah, no, I think that that's an awesome point and perspective that you bring because a lot of time we only look at it as what their life is or involving around just sports in general, but not what those personal relationships are like with family, friends, etc. What the classroom situation's like. So no, that's super super awesome, and I'm really glad that you brought that up. And kind of looking at common mental hurdles that athletes face. I know for myself when I was in school, I always knew that there was things that I was kind of going through, but since I didn't have anybody on campus and any resources to go to, I never could really quite understand what that was, right? Come to find out it's probably, a mixture of performance anxiety, lack of confidence and some fear of failure, right? But at the end of the day, are there kind of, with the athletes you work with, are there, some more common mental hurdles that you see on a day-to-day basis? And, how do you help those athletes really overcome those certain challenges?
Yes, I'm thinking recently confidence seems to be a big hurdle. Really, not just like self-confidence, but self-efficacy is a fun word to throw around there. Self-confidence is more of like the generalized confidence that you have. And kind of that self-efficacy is really your own belief in your abilities. Like it's the component of trust. So, do you trust yourself? Do you trust that you feel in control when something feels out of control? Do you trust your training? Do you trust what your coaches have been telling you for feedback? And that seems to be a big hurdle that a lot of athletes that I work with have come to me about. And really looking at, okay, what specifically is contributing to this? Because it's not just one cause, right? Like you were talking about fear of failure as a possible contributor to that. And there's so many things that can kind of contribute to one's lack of confidence, lack of trust in themselves. So, yeah, really looking at confidence as one thing. And I'm thinking now too, as they're speaking, a lot of self talk. So, that can kind of go into what are you really telling yourself in your head? What's the narrative in your head that you are developing versus what is reality? And a lot of times, I always like to nerd out on just looking at kind of like the research of why we focus so much on negative thoughts, right? And a good portion, I believe it was about 75% where I found in this research, like neuroscience research I was reading, that we focus about three-quarters of our thoughts like on negative thoughts. And that makes so much sense, right? Whether that's like neurologically and biologically, some chemical component, but even just how we are wired everything comes down to how often are you focusing on something? How often are you prioritizing it? And then from there, how can we plan to train otherwise? How can we, if we're used to something, familiarity, we have to change it up, and change feels very weird. It can feel strange, it can feel exciting and new. And that's kind of where those neural components, we have to create new neural pathways for that. So self-talk also, which goes into confidence, also everything's connected. Everything's connected.
I love that. And I think too, self-talk from a lot of the individuals who I've talked to specifically on like the licensed, professional side has been such a big thing and an important thing for instilling that confidence, right? Because to your point, a lot of us have those negative talks about, hey, are we good enough? Hey, how do we really stack up against here? And instead of building ourselves up, we're almost putting ourselves down when we need to be our biggest cheerleaders from time to time and, really be that positive influence. So I completely agree with you there. And I know for myself and, a lot of the athletes that I've talked to the past couple of months here, the two biggest things that they've talked about for some of, I don't want to say, issues or stuff that they're dealing with necessarily, but the two main topics were either, around anxiety or pressure. And I know for myself, looking back, pressure was a huge thing, whether it was, the pressure to be a starter, the pressure to perform in front of family and friends and not let teammates or coaches down, and ultimately the pressure to maintain that success. And, in a sport like baseball, where, hey, if you have a bad game or two, maybe you're now benched and somebody else is taking that role. But with that being said, what are some effective strategies that you found to be able to help some of those athletes out who are dealing with either the anxiety or the pressure of their sport?
Yeah. Emotional regulation is fun. Anxiety. Yes, I would say that was probably another thing that athletes tend to want help from and notice. They're very aware of it, of how either ill prepared they are or very prepared. But yes, pressure situations bring out a lot of colors, a lot from what you have not coped with, what you have not dealt with. And so a couple things that I are typically my go-to. Of course, not like no athlete is the same, and that's why I say they're quote unquote my go-to. I kind of revolve around, I feel breathing is a good, there's so many different breathing techniques that then can go into how do you do it mindfully? How do you do it within meditation? And I know there's a couple athletes that have been on like ESPN or even just the NBA that sit there and the cameraman focuses on how they're doing breathing, they're doing mindful meditation. And they're not just doing that because it looks cool or it's like new age or however, it actually works depending on what you're wanting from it. So, from like a high intensity performance arena, you are wanting to either be really hyped up, if that's kind of the level of performance, we call it arousal or energy that you're wanting. Or you can bring yourself back down to baseline if that's a little too much and you feel unfocused, because sometimes the more you raise energy and like that anxious arousal, the more you can be caught off guard and not focus on the cues that you need to focus on specifically. This happens either way. But yeah, breathing techniques such as like square breathing. I know a lot of people have heard of that, where you can do a count, like, for example, a count in for 5, hold for 5, out for 5, and then hold for 5. And you just keep going around in a circle. That one's really nice for just leveling off and keeping yourself at baseline with not just your thoughts, but kind of your body. So you're also bringing your body back to like a homeostasis of some sort, versus like breathing that can energize you if you really need some energy and you're just feeling really low. That can be coupled with music as you're doing it. So some high intensity music. Now, obviously, energized breathing isn't like hyperventilation. We don't do that. But enough to increase everything, and like the sense there's science behind it. There's always that you are able to basically have like a natural caffeinated high in a way, if that makes sense. So yeah, breathing, music, And all of this kind of goes coupled with, I always love to talk to athletes about pre-performance routines, during performance routines and post. I always feel like that's really important to not just be prepared before in the moments that you need to like switch things up during a play or a competition. And then after, you always want to debrief because you never want to just sit with what you performed. You want to be able to move forward with it and how you can get better. So, yes, all of those things coupled together with breathing as a skill to use within that.